Member for Light.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to make a contribution to this debate on this very important bill, and it is a very important bill by virtue of the rights it seeks to take away from our citizens. And Mr Speaker, I think at times we take our democracy for granted. At times we assume that we don't have to actually be here to protect our democracy, to strengthen our democracy. It will just be around for us when we need it. Well, when you look overseas, Mr Acting Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, that couldn't be further from the truth. We have seen over the last 10 years a decline in democracy across the world, a decline in liberal democracies, a decline in citizen participation in various nations. And this is not just nations which we normally just associate with, what you might call either third world republics or despots, but also in the biggest democracy in the world, in a Western sense, and that's the United States. Mr Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, there are an increasing number of reports coming out of America where individual states are creating laws about the voting franchise to ensure that it minimises certain people from being able to participate in their elections. In America, unfortunately, some political parties have the view that if you don't like the way people are voting, the best thing to do is not to change your policies or to improve what you do, is to make sure those people who don't like what you're doing don't get a chance to vote. And it's been truly a campaign in America to minimise the franchise of African Americans, who generally speaking, on most occasions, would vote for the Democratic Party. So in those states, Mr Deputy Speaker, where Republicans hold the reins, and because of the unique way the American political system operates, even though they have a federal election, the electoral rules for those federal elections actually are controlled by individual states. So we have, electoral boundaries which are drawn in a way to minimise the impact or the effect of particular voter populations. In fact, the Playmander has its origins in America. I think it was called the salamander, and I can't remember the member's name, but certainly the electorate was drawn like a salamander, and to make sure that a certain voting outcome was achieved in a particular state. I can't remember the state, probably Alabama or Louisiana, one of those more progressive states in the United States who have a good record in democracy. But, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Acting Speaker, the point I'm trying to make here is that laws drawn to reduce the voting franchise are, by their very nature, anti-democratic, but also underline one of the most fundamental rights in our democracy, in our society, and that's the right to vote. And that, in my view, voting is just not a right, but it's always a responsibility. I think it's important that we all participate in that process to make sure that people make their contribution towards protecting and strengthening our democracy. If I believe it's a responsibility of ours to actually make sure that we do participate in the democratic process, then I think it's incumbent on governments of any persuasion to make sure we make it as easy as possible for people to participate. The reality is people comply with laws, do the right thing when you make it as easy as possible for them to do so. What this proposed changes to the law will actually make it harder to people to do the right thing, make it harder for people to participate, make it much more difficult for people to do the right thing, which I believe is to participate in an electoral process. I'm not suggesting the electoral process is the start and end of our political process, but it's certainly an important part, and it's an important part to engage people in that process. So this proposed provision to reduce or close off the electoral roll sooner can only have one effect, is to reduce the number of people who are going to be eligible to vote on election day. That is simply the only impact it can have. So it will have the impact of disenfranchising a whole range of people in our community from participating. Mr Speaker, some of those have been covered by the other speakers very well, but I think it's important to emphasise, because this bill, if passed by this parliament, will have the impact of reducing the capacity of people in my electorate to participate in an electoral process. And who are some of these people, Mr Speaker? Certainly young people will be on. Young people are generally more mobile and therefore need to make sure they're on electoral roll, but people coming on electoral roll for the first time, it's very important. We've heard a number of speakers talk about the declining number of younger people who actually are enrolling, which is sad to hear, because the young people I engage with certainly are fully engaged in community life and also civic life, and it's certainly keen to exercise their political rights. So we need to ensure that we make it easier. In fact, for a number of years, and I assume it still happens, the Electoral Commission or schools will participate in a program. We go into schools for year 11s and 12s, and you get young people to start enrolling, and even though their enrolment doesn't come back to them until they're 18, but at 17 they can actually put their names on the roll ready to vote. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a very good thing to do that. And so that is an example of doing the right thing, of making sure we maximise the capacity of people to participate in our electoral process. We have First Nations people, and I have a significant First Nations community in my electorate. This bill would have again the effect of discriminating against that group of people by closing off the rolls early. And in fact, by doing that, we are setting the electoral, if you like, the electoral pendulum back to the pre-referendum of 1966, 67. We actually are going back to the days where we say, if you're a First Nations person, that you shouldn't be participating in our political process. That is the effect of this bill, Mr Speaker. Then we have mentioned people with disabilities and other people who are vulnerable in our community, older people, people who actually, for a whole range of reasons, would need the extra time to make sure they can participate. And then one of the other groups I'd like to also mention, Mr Deputy Speaker, is new citizens. If we want new citizens to fully integrate in our community, engaging them in the political process is extremely important. It is extremely important because when they exercise their right to vote, they actually feel a greater sense of belonging to this country, their new country.
So Member for Lyne, I might suggest you seek leave to continue your remarks.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is